We're now going to look at solving quadratic equations by using quadratic formula. To solve a quadratic equation using the formula, we first of all need to make sure that our equation is in standard form, so our x squared term followed by our x term followed by our constant term and set equal to 0. This is our quadratic formula down here. Now you'll know from factorising or solving quadratic equations by factorising that we often get two solutions. This is where the plus and minus come in. So basically our quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. This will be on your formula sheet, but it's always a good idea to learn these things by heart anyway. Now the most important thing about using a quadratic formula is knowing when to use it. So this note down here is really important. A question that asks you to solve a quadratic equation and give your answer to a number of decimal places or significant figures is basically the exam board's way of telling you you are going to need to use the quadratic formula to answer the question. So if you're asked to solve a quadratic equation and it doesn't give mention of decimal places and significant figures, it generally means you can solve it by factorising, which will be easier and quicker. But if the question asks you to give your answer to a number of decimal places or significant figures, then you're going to need to use this formula. In this example here, we have a quadratic equation. It's in standard quadratic form, so we've got our x squared term, followed by our x term, followed by our constant term, and it's set equal to 0. The important part here is recognising this sentence is telling us to use the quadratic formula. So a quadratic equation where it's asking us to round our answers to two decimal places means I'm going to have to use the formula. The reason for that is this quadratic expression up to the 11, this will not factorise. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to write down our values of a, b and c. Now a is the coefficient of the x squared term, so that's 2. B is the coefficient of the x term, so that's positive 6. And c is the constant term, which is negative 11. That's why it's so important that you check at the very start of the question that it's in our standard quadratic form. Otherwise, you won't be able to easily read off a, b and c. We're then going to write out the formula, as always the case. If we're going to use a formula, we should ideally start by writing it out. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. The first mark here is for substituting into that. So just be careful around the first part. That starts as negative b. Now b is 6, so that's going to be negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 11. Really important that when you're substituting in negative numbers, they always substitute into a pair of brackets. That's all divided by 2a. A is 2, so 2 times 2. The next mark in this question is for evaluating the discriminant. The discriminant is this b squared minus 4ac part here. So not the square root sign, but everything underneath it counts as the discriminant. So all I would do is type that into a calculator, and that comes to 124. Now, this is where the plus or minus part comes in. We have that plus or minus symbol, which means literally that, plus the square root of the discriminant, or minus the square root of the discriminant. So at this point, I'm going to split that into two parts. So root 6 plus the square root of the discriminant. The discriminant is 124, all over 4, or negative 6 minus the square root of 124, all over 4. Each of these parts we're just going to type into our calculator individually. So what I would want to do here is make sure we start off by typing in the top part only. So just type in the negative 6 plus square root of 124. Press equals on your calculator, then divide by 4. That's the easiest way to make sure you're not going to make a mistake there. That's going to come to 1.28388. Or over here, that one is equal to negative 4.28388. Now, we do need to remember that we actually still do need to round our answers to two decimal places. So this is not only a clue telling us to use the quadratic formula, it's also a request in the question. So these answers as they stand are not okay. Each will need to be rounded to two decimal places. So that is equal to 1.28 and negative 4.28. And that's our two solutions to our quadratic equation. In the second example, we have again a quadratic equation. So we've got our x squared and we've got our equation here, the equal sign in the middle. But what you'll notice about this straight away, hopefully, is it's not in our standard quadratic form. So we're going to need to rearrange this so we have our x squared term followed by our x term followed by our constant term equal to 0. The other thing we've got here is this clue giving your answer to one decimal place, which tells me this is using the quadratic formula. So start off, we'll write this out, 2x squared plus 3 equals 20x, and we'll start to rearrange that by taking away 20x from both sides. That's going to give us 2x squared minus 20x plus 3 equals 0. You notice when I'm taking away that 20x from both sides, I'm sticking that negative 20x in the middle of the quadratic, so it's in our standard form. So let's now take our values of a, b and c. So a is 2, b is negative 20, and c is 3. Be really careful of this. If you don't put it in standard quadratic form first and you leave it in this form, then people often get mixed up and use the wrong values of a, b and c because they forget that that 20 will change to a negative 20 when rearranged. As a first step, and quite often it can be a mark, make sure you rearrange it. So our quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a, and we can start to substitute into that. Now b is negative 20 this time, so we need to make sure that when we substitute it in here, we realise it's negative 20, which means we're going to actually have positive 20 here. So positive 20 plus or minus the square root of, and again we're going to have negative 20 in here. It's going to have to go in a set of brackets. We always sub negatives in brackets. So negative 20 all squared minus 4 times 2 times 3. Make that square root sign a bit longer. All over 2a, so 2 times 2. Again, what we're looking to do at this stage is evaluate the discriminant. The discriminant is the bit underneath the square root sign, so that can go into our calculator, and that comes to 376. So that is equal to 20, and again we're going to use the plus or minus symbol here to split this into two parts, so 20 plus the square root of, and the discriminant was 376, all over 2 2's, which are 4, or 20 minus the square root of 376, all divided by 4. Again, both of these will go into your calculator. Remember, again, when you're typing into your calculator, type in the whole of the numerator first, press equals, then divide by 4, and do that for each one. And we end up with 9.8477, or 0.1523. Now again, not only is this part up here a clue to use quadratic formula, but it is actually asking you to give your answer to one decimal place. So each of these will need to be rounded to one decimal place. So that's equal to 9.8 or 0.2, and that's our final answer there.